Supplier compliance failures are moving up the liability chain. Supplier compliance audit failures are creating downstream liability that procurement teams are underpricing. Most procurement teams treat supplier compliance audits as a vendor management function. The legal and regulatory environment in 2026 is treating them as something closer to a liability transfer mechanism. When a supplier fails a compliance requirement and the buyer cannot demonstrate it knew, asked, and verified, the liability does not stay at the supplier level. It travels. There is a version of supplier compliance management that has worked well for years. Send a questionnaire, review the responses, file the documentation, check the box. That version is increasingly inadequate in an environment where buyers are being held accountable for what their suppliers do or fail to do under environmental, safety, and sustainability frameworks that were not designed with clean liability cutoffs between contracting parties. Across construction, manufacturing, logistics, and industrial services, the direction of regulatory and legal pressure is consistent. Non-compliance is no longer being treated primarily as the supplier's problem to correct. It is being treated as evidence of a procurement and oversight failure by the buyer. That framing changes the financial exposure associated with supplier compliance gaps in ways that most procurement cost models have not yet captured. The Building Safety Act pattern is an early signal of where this is heading. The clearest current example of how supplier compliance liability travels upward comes from the United Kingdom's construction sector under the Building Safety Act, but the pattern is worth watching for its broader signal. Tier 1 contractors in major construction programs are now operating in an environment where they cannot prove a product is what it says it is, that an installer was competent, or that testing and approvals align with design intent, and the problem moves quickly from quality control to legal liability exposure. The buyer bought confidence that the records behind those materials would hold up under scrutiny. When they do not, the buyer's procurement decision itself becomes part of the liability chain. The operational response from major contractors has been more intrusive supplier vetting, more document checking, closer scrutiny of how subcontractors manage evidence across procurement, installation, and handover. That shift is driven not by preference, but by legal exposure. Procurement teams in industrial sectors facing parallel regulatory pressure are not yet running the same model. The companies that wait until regulatory enforcement makes it unavoidable will have a harder time building those capabilities than the ones that move now. Scope 3 reporting requirements have made supplier data a compliance asset. For procurement teams managing supply chains under Scope 3 emissions reporting obligations, supplier compliance has a second dimension that did not exist 5 years ago. The accuracy of an organization's Scope 3 Category 1 and Category 3 emissions disclosures depends entirely on the quality of data coming from suppliers. A buyer who discloses Scope 3 emissions based on spend-based estimates because actual supplier data is unavailable is not in a compliant posture under frameworks that expect measured, traceable emissions. The gap between what the buyer discloses and what is actually happening at the supplier level is an accuracy problem that increasingly shows up during external assurance reviews. The 2026 Sustainable Procurement Barometer, published by EcoVadis and Accenture, found that nearly 80% of buyers have visibility into the sustainability performance of more than half of their Tier 1 suppliers, but only 12% have that level of visibility into Tier 2 suppliers. That gap is significant because Scope 3 obligations do not stop at Tier 1. Supply chain emissions tracking requirements under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, and major buyer requirements are progressively extending to deeper supply chain tiers. A procurement compliance program designed only around Tier 1 visibility is leaving a structural gap that will widen as reporting requirements mature. Point-in-time audits are not detecting the compliance failures that inspections find. Annual supplier audits are still the dominant compliance verification mechanism in most procurement programs. They are also the mechanism least likely to catch the compliance failures that are generating enforcement actions. A point-in-time audit confirms what a supplier looks like on the day the auditor visits. Permit drift, training record gaps, and corrective action maintenance failures are not conditions that develop on audit day. They develop between audits, and they are most likely to be caught when a regulator visits, not when the buyer does. The gap between annual audit cycles and continuous compliance status is not a new observation, but the regulatory stakes around it have changed. When a supplier receives an enforcement action for a violation that the buyer's last audit did not find, the question that follows is whether the buyer's audit was designed to find it. If the audit protocol was built around a standard questionnaire that does not map to the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the supplier's jurisdiction and operations, the answer is probably no. That answer has legal and reputational implications for the buyer that an annual compliance certificate does not protect against. Continuous monitoring using real-time supplier data, regulatory filing checks, and incident alerts is moving from a best practice to a baseline expectation in sectors where supplier compliance failures carry buyer liability. The suppliers most likely to produce compliance surprises are the ones that look fine on an annual audit and have no monitoring between them. What procurement teams are buying when they buy supplier compliance? The practical reframe for procurement leadership is that supplier compliance documentation is not a vendor management deliverable. It is evidence that the buyer exercised appropriate due diligence. When a compliance failure occurs at the supplier level, the documentation the buyer holds determines whether that failure is treated as the supplier's problem or as evidence of the buyer's inadequate oversight. Those are legally and financially different outcomes. Building that documentation requires more than questionnaire responses and annual audit reports. It requires audit protocols mapped to the specific regulatory programs applicable to each supplier's operations, including state-level requirements that differ from federal baselines. It requires evidence of follow-up on identified gaps, not just identification. And it requires a monitoring cadence that bridges the gap between audit cycles for suppliers whose compliance failures carry meaningful liability exposure. That is a different kind of procurement infrastructure than most organizations have built. The ones building it now are not doing it because it is good practice. They are doing it because they have priced the alternative. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.